Hey everybody, thank you so much for signing up to be a part of this conference, this sort of virtual event, talking all about how relational ministry accompaniment can impact and influence every aspect of our relationships and the kind of work that we do with young people. So I'm Dr. Josh Packard, Executive Director of Springtide Research Institute, and I'll be presenting findings in just a few minutes from our State of Religion and Young People Report, Catholic Edition. Thanks to a very generous donation from a family foundation, we've been able to provide this Catholic edition for free in digital form, and it really gives a deep dive exploration into how Catholic young people compare with young people across the rest of the country on a variety of measures. And it lays out this framework of relational authority that is so important in this era for how we engage with young people and build relationships with them that are truly impactful and that really matter and last over the long haul as opposed to maybe short-term transactional kinds of things. I'm really excited to share that data with you here. You're gonna get to see the whole presentation with the slides, and then we're gonna come back in person and do a panel discussion, answer some questions, and do some breakout stuff. So thanks again. Really appreciate all the work that you do in the lives of young people, and we hope to be a resource for you here at Springtide, and of course with our partners and brethren, our kinfolk here at St. Mary's Press. So I'm really excited to do this. Can't wait to see you all in person. I'd like to spend some time today talking about our newest study, the State of Religion in Young People. But before we get to that, I think it's important that we share something about who Springtide is, because we're sort of new and you might not have heard of us yet. Been around for a couple of years, year and a half or so, really, that we just have been getting started, and we really sit at the intersection of young people's inner and outer lives. So their faith and daily lives, and our sort of mission statement you see there. We believe no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone. So we conduct actionable research to reflect the inner and outer lives of 13 to 25-year-olds in order to help those who care about young people care better. Of course, the people who care about young people are folks just like you, and we think that we explicitly take this approach that we go wherever young people are having these conversations, wherever they're having conversations about life's biggest questions. That's where we go to find out how they're having them, who's with them, what informs those conversations, how they're making sense of the world around them. In 2020, then we summed all of that work up in this report, The State of Religion and Young People. So over 10,000 surveys that we did, over 150 interviews with 13 to 25-year-olds, and all of which produced this framework that I think is potentially really useful for helping us to rethink how we move through the world from programs over to relationships. This called relational authority. And I'll explain more about that as we go through the presentation today. And of course, after this is over, you're watching this and you're going to gather, and we'll have some time together. So jot down questions, and we'll be able to ask those live, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. You will, when you watch this video, you'll have a chance to get the findings. You can download the State of Religion and Young People for free, thanks to a really generous donation. And about the time that we're gathering in person, then we'll have an updated edition that I'll talk about in just a second. But the digital version of this you can get on Apple Books or on our website is really fascinating. Not just the findings, but the way that we have, the way that we have gone about presenting those findings, meaning that we've managed to put all of our or many of our digital assets that we created throughout the year right inside of the digital book itself. So you can listen to podcasts, interviews with experts. You can dig deeper into the data and see different breakdowns, things like that. You can listen to podcasts from the voices of young people, which season 3 that goes along with this study is all just young people telling you in their own words how their faith impacts their lives, and it's across the spectrum. So you get such a diverse group of young people who are contributing here and helping you to understand what their thought processes are, how their faith impacts their decisions, their careers, their future ambitions, et cetera, et cetera. And we've removed the interviewer, so it's there's no commentary; it's just them. It's super great, and I think really maybe one of the more impactful things that I've been a part of is getting to make the podcast version that goes along with each of our studies. And then in January, the updated edition, the new edition, will be a specifically Catholic edition of the State of Religion and Young People for 2020. So again, when we were working on the State of Religion and Young People, the overall edition, we had a family foundation come to us and say, we'd love to see just a Catholic breakdown of this report, and so that's what we've done, and that's what I'm going to talk about today, is largely the data from that. The relational authority framework stays intact. The assets change. The book has the report, then the Catholic edition of the report then allows us to dig in by virtue of some guest authors that wrote prefaces and additional excerpts and things inside of the book. We're able to think about this through more of a theological lens, as Springtide really sits in, right on the framework of behavioral science and allows different faith groups and traditions to bring their theology to it, to our research. I was excited to get to see this come to life in the Catholic edition of the State of Religion and Young People. So all of that is the sort of background for what we're going to talk about today. What is going on, in other words, with the religious lives of 13 to 25-year-olds, specifically in today's conversation, we'll be talking about Catholic young people and making those comparisons and seeing where there might be some meaningful differences. Before we dive into the data, though, I want to ask just a general question, which I know it's absurd to do, right? We're on a video. Who's going to answer this question? You're going to answer it. You're going to answer it in your head. You can keep yourself honest by writing it down. Because I'm going to show you some data after this, and you're going to have to reassess whether you were right or wrong. It's a self-scored quiz, like all the kids love these days. Religion in America. Is it dying or thriving? Is it dying or thriving? This is a question that has consumed sociologists, my field, for a while now, because the hysteria, one way or the other, doesn't always match the data one way or the other, and trying to sort of square that circle can be a difficult trick. So let's look at some data. I'm going to show you some data here from Pew and Gallup, other nationally reputable sources, but not Springtide yet. So this question: how important would you say religion is in your own life, going back to 1993 all the way to 2017 in this case? And what you see at the top line there is people saying it's very important. And at the bottom line in the yellow, people who have no opinion about religion, and the folks in the middle. And you see that sort of the blue is kind of declining, and it definitely a rise in the gray of people saying it's not very important. But overall, you've got something like roughly 80-ish% of the population saying that it's either very important or fairly important to their life. The decline certainly is existing, but overwhelmingly, people say in this country that religion is important to them. Depending on what kind of news you consume and who you're around, that might come as an astonishing fact to you. You might think it's too high. Some of you might think that number is too low. I think it could really go either way, depending on, like I said, your own experiences. Let's look at another piece of data then. Do you believe in God? Well, we have pretty good information. I just went back to 1944 because it seemed like a reasonable place to stop. 96% of the people in 1944 said yes. It goes up to 98%, all the way down to 87% in 2017. I don't know what to make of the people who have no opinion about their belief in God. It seems like an odd position to take for me. But again, clearly downward trend, but obviously not a number that is like falling off a cliff. It's not like we're running around in a world, in a country full of people who do not believe in God at all. The vast majority of the population believes in God. This next chart, there's no way you're going to be able to make sense of it right away. It would take a while. It took me a while. So I'll explain it to you. On the vertical axis there, what we've got is a frequency of daily prayer. So if you're 100, that means you always pray every single day. You see Afghanistan right up there, close to 100% of the people saying that they engage in daily prayer. And then across the horizontal axis, what you've got is GDP per capita, and a pretty clear trend, which is that as countries get wealthier, they tend to pray less frequently, with one exception. Who's the weirdo in this group? Well, we're the weirdos in this group. The United States, you see us, I'm going to point, but it won't make any sense because, we're on a screen. You see us way over there. Of the 102 countries, the US is the only one with both above average GDP per capita and above average frequency of daily prayer. In part, that's because in the United States, we don't have really, we are together in one country, but there are multiple realities inside of our one country. If you were to break us out by income level, you would see a curve that looks a lot more like the general curve, although not exactly the same. We would still be higher than many of these other countries. And then finally, we get to that, and we're trying to add up all this evidence and find out, what is the, are we a religious country or not a religious country? Is it dying or thriving? Well, this is data that you're probably familiar with. The rise of the unaffiliated population, the nones, N-O-N-E-S. So in all cases, this is from the General Social Survey that's done every couple of years. Pew and Gallup find slightly different numbers, but again, the same trend, which is more important than this particular number, which is an increase in the people who are claiming no affiliation. So on a survey, when we ask people, are you Christian Protestant, Christian Catholic, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, etc., we list all the things that we want to list. At the bottom, there's a box that says none of the above. And if you check that box, then you are one of the nones. And this is a number that has gotten a whole lot of attention over the last few years. That leads many people to the conclusion that religion is dying in this country because we see the rise of people who are not affiliated. So if you're not if more and more people are not affiliated, then religion must be dying, right? Springtide's own research. So most of these, all of these studies only go down to 18 years old. At Springtide, we think it's really critical, and we spend the extra time and resources to go all the way down to 13 years old. And we see much the same trend, or an indication that the trend is going to continue, and a slightly higher number, with 39% of 13 to 25-year-olds claiming no religious affiliation. So all that brings us back to that question that I asked you: is religion dying or thriving? And I don't know. That's the answer that I have for you. I don't know. And I'm a sociologist of religion. We're supposed to know that stuff. We're supposed to be able to weigh in and tell you which of those is the right answer. I've been thinking a lot about this over the last decade, more, maybe it's more, I guess it's probably more. And I think that largely what's happening is not this question of dying or thriving, but that something else is going on. And that Nancy Ammerman, who is a professor of, or now emeritus at Boston University of Sociology of Religion, she wrote this fantastic book called Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes. And in that, she wrote, in a time of significant change, we cannot assume that we will find religion in the predictable places or in the predictable forms. And if we do not find as much of it in those predictable places as we did before, we cannot assume that it is disappearing. In other words, we may just be looking in the wrong places. She goes on to say, we're only just now coming to terms with the fact that more and more religion happens outside of traditional institutions. She was very sort of ahead of the time when she wrote this, part of the reason why she's so brilliant. And I think that's what's going on. We keep looking in the predictable places for religion, but we're not in a normal time. We are in a time of significant change, really significant change. And we keep looking, in those times of significant change, when you go looking for the normal stuff in an abnormal world, you're just not going to find it. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist there. It might just exist somewhere else. I'm going to take one little slight turn aside here, and I want to ask you a separate question. Are you a good friend? Show of hands. Are you a good friend? I assume if you are like everybody else that I've asked this question to, including my own classes, you are sitting right now watching this on your phone or in your office and with your hands. You can put your hands down now. I don't need you to hold them up for forever. Just wanted to get them up in the air for a second. Of course, we're all good friends. Howard Becker is the sociologist that you see pictured here. And he has I think, a really profound way of thinking about these kinds of categories. He would challenge us, instead of saying, are you a good friend? Because everybody thinks they're a good friend. The question isn't, that isn't really the question. The question is, have you ever behaved poorly to somebody that you considered a friend? Or have you ever been friendly to somebody who is an enemy? That's the question. Because what is ultimately the benefit of being able to say that you are a good friend or so and so isn't a good friend? And we draw boxes around that. Even if we could all agree on what the criteria were, what would you do with that information? Maybe at best you would try and categorize all the bad friends and not become friends with them, I guess. Another version of this question I ask my classes is, was I a good student? I got a PhD. Was I a good student? Even though there were definitely classes that I didn't study for and ended up getting failing test grades, which is basically all of physics in my freshman year. What point do you cross over from being good student to bad student, or from bad student to good student? How do we tally all those things up? And then again, ultimately, the more important thing is, what do you do with that? In other words, what circumstances would cause you to behave poorly toward a friend of yours? That's the more useful question, because once we understand that answer, well, then we could begin to alter the circumstances in order to alter behavior and change the world ultimately that we're living in. What Becker says, in terms of summing this up, is that there are types of activities, not types of people. We're all capable of doing anything at any given moment. Now, we generally don't, the whole world is not actually at our disposal. We are more likely to do some things than others. What are the circumstances that constrain our activities to a small subset and sort of eliminate this other subset of things? We are having a version of that conversation, of the types of people conversation right now when it comes to young people and religion in this country, even when it comes to is religion dying or thriving in this country. And at Springtide, we firmly believe that we're having the wrong conversation. We think this is just a wholly unhelpful way to think about what is actually going on in the world, because we're looking in the sort of normal places during an abnormal time. Let me explain what I mean by that. So it wasn't too long ago that, maybe your parents or your grandparents generation, that our world was relatively simple, socially speaking. And I mean big capital S social. I don't mean like, having drinks with friends. Most of what we did in life was channeled through these social institutions. There's more than 4 of them probably, but I just picked 4 to be illustrative. We've got, places that you went to school, places you worshiped, social clubs you belonged to, places you worked. These were who we were. It's not just that we engaged with these institutions, they channeled our whole lives. They were our entire identities. And aside from that, anything else that we did was a hobby. For the most part. My grandfather's hobby was fishing, but if you asked him who he was, he would tell you that he was a veteran, or that he was an alum of this particular college, or that he worked at Land O'Lakes Creamery. That's how he would describe who he was as a person. These things lived in us. In other words, they were our identities. Now, that is a relatively simple world, because all we have to do in that world is to align ourselves with one of these institutions or a combination of them, and we automatically have authority over the people who identify with that institution. So, my grandfather had a boss at the creamery, and by virtue of the fact that he was a boss, my grandfather accorded him some respect and listened to him. There was no there's, what I mean? Like, outside of these institutions, there's no boss. Like, there's no boss of fishing that my grandfather was going to listen to. That doesn't even make any sense. So if you're trying to reach young people, for example, all you have to do in this world is say, get a title as a pastor, as a youth pastor at a church. And you will automatically have young people who will listen to you. In fact, I asked my dad this question, who was an influential adult in his life when he was growing up besides his parents. And he said the priest, because he's Catholic, and he said the priest was influential. I would have listened to the priest, whatever he said. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I don't remember you talking about a priest. And he said, oh, no, not a priest, the priest. It didn't matter. He moved a lot. He was like, it doesn't matter who the priest was. I would have just listened to the priest. And I think it's a really good example of what this means by, like, we just need to align ourselves with one of those institutions, and we automatically have some authority conveyed to us over other people inside into their lives, some ability to influence what they do, how they think, what they believe. But now we get to the part of like dramatic social change. When we start looking at people's trust levels in institutions, they have fallen right off a cliff. Like we talked about belief levels earlier not falling off a cliff. Well, trust levels in institutions have. We can look at those for adults, but at Springtide, again, we focus on young people. And what we see here is that when we ask young people, 13 to 25-year-olds, to assess their trust levels, they're actually just a touch lower than the general population of 18 to 100-year-olds. And you're probably going to, as you scan through that list, know that I've noted out to the side that young Catholics have about a half a point higher on levels of institutional trust. So they're, young Catholics tend to be a little bit more trustworthy than the general population, but not dramatically so. And of course, you're going to go right to organized religion. You see right there in the middle, right above the media and right below public schools. These things are so close that they could shift in terms of their ranking depending on the margin of error of the survey. But the big thing to pay attention to is not who you're beating or losing to, but rather that this is a 10-point scale. This is a 10-point scale. That means that the best, the most trustworthy social institutions that we have among young people are, in this case, nonprofits, and they're barely cracking the halfway point. In other words, we don't trust institutions, young people especially, but older people too. We do not trust institutions to live inside of our hearts like we might have once done. We can look at this data specifically at a micro level, and we see that 85% of young Catholics say they are more likely to take advice from someone who cares about them than just somebody with a title. 30% care is the thing that matters, not authority. 30% say that impressive job titles do not matter to them. And 11% of young Catholics say that if someone has an impressive title, they automatically don't trust them, which is concerning for those of us who got PhDs and have been professors for a while. We would love for that to be flipped, as I'm sure pastors and priests would as well. But it's not the case. The title is not enough anymore, if it ever was. And so, these institutions are not enough. Our world has become infinitely more complex. There's a whole lot of other things that are like vying for people's attention. And we don't take them as a part of our identity anymore. They are things and resources that we interact with, that we put together and amalgamate. Young people tell us that they sort of, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, like, yeah, I go to work over there, but that's not who I am. That's just what I do for money. It's actually this thing that I'm doing online that's really an expression of who I am as a person, et cetera, et cetera. Again, a world that would have been largely unrecognizable a couple of generations ago. And in this world, this is a dramatic shift, because in this world, the more you align yourself with one particular institution, then the less authority that you get into the life of a person, especially a young person. You understand that? So when all that trust erodes, and when all these competing forces come in, and people are inclined to distrust institutional authority and choose bits and pieces of ever more things, that means that the more you double down on that approach to say, like, I am not just, I don't just hold the title of super cool, amazing person at this company. I'm like super cool, most awesome, amazing person with certifications and blah, 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 blah at this organization. So you really have to listen to me. The more you do that, the more you align yourself in that way, the less people are likely to listen to you. It does not mean that they doubt your expertise. We're going to get to that. It doesn't mean they doubt your expertise. It just means that they're not necessarily going to listen to your expertise. And this is what I mean by having the wrong conversation. We keep having this conversation about affiliated and unaffiliated. But when we complicate all of these things through that changing lens of trust, what we see is that affiliated and unaffiliated just don't mean what they used to mean. We used to, if somebody said they were affiliated, in other words, they're not a nun, that meant that we could assume a whole bunch of things about them based on that one categorization. As Becker reminds us, so that's thinking about types of people as opposed to types of activities. And we get into real trouble when we start thinking about types of people. In fact, what we find is that 52% of affiliated young people and 49% of young Catholics, so about the same, have little to no trust in organized religion. In other words, these are people saying they're checking the box, saying that they're Christian, Protestant or Christian Catholic, and then they're telling us that also about half of them don't trust those organized expressions of religion. 20% of young people who tell us that they are affiliated with a religious tradition also tell us that they're not a religious person, though. They don't want that identity or label. Nearly a third of affiliated young people told us that they do not think it's important to have a faith community. 33%, a third again, of affiliated young people attend religious services once a year or less. And over 1 in 5 young people who tell us that they are affiliated with a religious tradition also tell us they don't try to live out their religious beliefs in their daily lives. That number drops from raises from 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 for young Catholics, and another 1 in 4 number there. 1 in 4 young people who claim a Catholic identity tell us they are not a religious person. There is clearly something going on here then that the categories of affiliated, the simple category of affiliated doesn't capture. And tell us at all what's happening and or representing the diversity of religious expression and the complexity of religious expression in young people's lives. Monica, 23, told us, I guess if you have to put a label on it, I'm Christian, but with everything in today's world, I literally don't know. I just think spiritual, maybe. Now, the problem there for me is not that Monica is or isn't Christian or Buddhist or whatever. It's that last part. It's really that last line. I mean, the last word, when she says, maybe. Monica's 23 years old. And it's okay to have doubts, obviously, and to be exploring and trying to figure things out. But the idea that you can sort of hear in her voice, even on the written page, the written word on the page, that she's like not even really sure how to go about answering the question. It makes me sad for Monica that she doesn't have better guides in her life helping her through those. And we heard stuff like this time and time again from young people over the last year, and we continue to hear it as we do more research at Springtide, that they just sort of don't even have language for beginning to make this exploration anymore. Same story when we get to the unaffiliated. Yeah, sure, they're unaffiliated, which you might think could tell you some things, but 60% of unaffiliated young people say that they are at least slightly spiritual. Over a fourth of unaffiliated young people say that they try to live out their religious beliefs in their daily lives. Your guess is as good as mine about what that means. We're going to be trying to figure that out in 2021. 19% of unaffiliated young people say that they attend religious gatherings at least once a month. 38% of unaffiliated young people say that they are religious. And 1 in 10 of unaffiliated young people say that they've become more religious over the last 5 years. So rather than thinking about these types of people, what we have been finding is that it's relationships. These are the processes that matter. These are the circumstances that really dictate a young person's religious identities and outcomes. 27% of young people have 1 or fewer adults in their lives that they can turn to if they need to talk, though. 31% of 18 to 25-year-olds and 19% of 13 to 17-year-olds. That includes their parents. We're talking about roughly somewhere between a fifth to a third of young people, somewhere in that neighborhood, call it a fourth if you want to split the difference, have 1 or fewer adults, including their parents, that they could turn to if they needed to talk. But these relationships are really important. 69% only have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions on a day-to-day basis, but 41% depend on a close relationship to help them find meaning and purpose in their life. And when they're turning to people, who are they turning to? Well, not religious leaders. They don't even have them that they could turn to. When we ask them to sort of check all that apply, of course, you see parents and guardians at the top. That's no surprise. But I was stunned to see religious leaders coming in at 8%. When we look at this, when we look at these data for Catholics, we see much the same story, and the number there is 6% for young Catholics that say that they have a religious leader that they can turn to. 65% again of Catholics have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions on a daily basis. 38% though still depend on somebody close to them. They do have more adults in their lives they could talk to, slightly within the margin of error. The adults are important. Religious leaders are essential. We have to do a better job of reaching out and making sure that religious leaders are accessible and known commodities in some ways, known resources to young people. As Megan told us, the effects here are really problematic. She told us nobody cares. Nobody is really listening. So what do we need to do here? Well, I think the answer is pretty clear. I mean, we do live in this world that is maybe not governed by, but is sort of organized in some ways, at least our activity through these institutions. That's not going away. Nobody's suggesting that we make like higher education a free for all and people can just like read all the Wikipedia pages they want and then get a degree. We're still going to have universities. We're still going to have churches. The question is, what are we going to be doing with them? How are we going to be engaging with people at those places? And the data, the research that we did in 2020 at Springtide are pretty overwhelming. That we need to replace all those institutions with people. It's really simple. We have to replace all those institutions with people. My students do not care that I'm a professor at a university, even though it's a university that they're paying money to. They'll do the things that I tell them to do because I have some like stick to hold over their head that I could fail them if they don't do them. But they don't actually care. They don't really internalize the lessons of sociology or come to me with their problems or reveal their struggles to me until they know that I care about them. My degrees don't matter. They need to know that I care about them, that this is a place for them. Just like those institutions used to live identity-wise, sort of, it's weird for me to talk about like having those things live inside my grandfather's heart, not because I didn't think he had a heart, but I just don't think he would like the touchy-feely language. That's what we need to have happen here, because that's what's already happening. When we asked young people in those interviews that we did with them, what sort of governs their lives, how they find meaning and purpose in life, well, they didn't tell us about organizations. They didn't tell us about people who are in charge, authorities. They told us about individuals. They told us about a really important teacher that they had, a family member who is always responsive to them, a mentor who listens to them all the time. What they told us specifically, and if you can see behind me here in our first study, belonging, what they explicitly said was, when I go somewhere, that's just attendance. But just because I'm going somewhere, like showing up for class or showing up for a youth group, doesn't mean that I, find a home there. It doesn't mean that I belong there. It's the people that are, if I feel like I have a sense of belonging anywhere, it's because there's somebody there that I'm connected to that connects me to others. And that's a critical lesson for us to learn. The oldest lesson in sociology, which is not the oldest discipline in the world. We're going on something like 140 years. But the very first lesson in my field is that belonging precedes believing. We get this backwards a lot of times. We think we got to gather a whole bunch of people who already agree on the basic tenets or outlines of a set of beliefs or a statement of faith or that we're all here for the same common purpose or whatever, and then a community will emerge out of it. But the reality is that those tend to be really short-lived and not very durable. The first challenge, the first wave, the first wind that comes knocks that flag right over. But if we want really durable groups to form or if we want groups to form with really durable sets of beliefs that stand the test of time, well, then we have to focus on the belonging first. So even though you might be sitting there as a religious leader saying to yourself, like, oh, okay, yeah, I mean, I would love for young people to belong somewhere and to have relationships with people, but at the end of the day, what I care about is like souls saved. So can't we just get to that part? Well, I don't think you can. I mean, at least that's what the data are telling us. I mean, theologically, I have no idea about the answer to that question, but sociologically, I understand the answer to that question, which is that you can't really get to the believing unless you get to the belonging first, not in any real true way. So how do we do this? Well, at Springtide, we rely a lot on the behavioral and social sciences to help inform the work that we do. And if we can take just one sort of brief hiatus here, what we would like to propose is this model called relational authority that comes out of this combination of sort of this old style traditional authority that was the solidarity of sameness, that sociologists would call it, of like, I know what your reality is like because my reality is the same, and we both sort of live the same world. And the solidarity of difference that characterizes the more modern world, where it's like, dentists do dentistry things, and I, at the university would do education things, and taxi drivers do taxi driver things. And then even though none of us could do each other's jobs, the world sort of gets together that way because we have experts certifying that we are future experts in that thing. We get a degree or a credential or a position at an organization.
When trust erodes, though, in those institutions, we can't just revert back to the solidarity of sameness, because those days are long gone. I mean, I don't even know what my neighbors do for a living, let alone pretending like we actually know what young people are facing on a day-to-day basis, like the intimate details of that. I mean, that's absurd. Um, Racial and gender differences alone complicate that to a point that nobody could really have that kind of grasp. We can't turn to that. In fact, what we need is a sort of meshing of those two things into this framework of relational authority. And this came right out of the interviews that we were doing and then tested with the surveys that we were conducting in the last year. And there end up being 5 aspects to relational authority: listening, transparency, integrity, care, and expertise. These 5 things coming together to create relational authority. 69% of young Catholics agree with the statement that a person's expertise does not matter if they don't care about me. Doesn't matter at all. Doesn't matter how smart you are. Doesn't matter how much you know, how much training you've had, what certifications you've been through. If a young person doesn't feel that you're sitting across from, doesn't feel like you care about them, that you have their best interests in mind and not your own best interests in mind, or what they often think, that you have the church's best interests in mind, and that is somehow separate from the young person's best interests, then they are not going to listen to you. But what does listening look like? Well, listening takes a very distinct form, and primarily what it means is time. 84% of young people ages 13 to 25 say they will trust someone who remembers things that they've shared. 82% say that they will trust someone who takes the time to hear what they have to say. 78% feel listened to when people show they understand. 80% feel listened to when people show that they care about them in those ways. So you have to be intentional about taking the time to listen and demonstrate that listening back to the person that you're sitting across from. We have these tide-turning tips throughout the state of religion and young people. And one of the things that communication research is a very simple way of like, how can we start doing, being better listeners tomorrow or today, right now? Communication researchers will tell us that we can adopt an open posture. So instead of sitting there, with our arms folded and our legs crossed, waiting to say the thing, because you know when a young person is like making a terrible choice or about to make a terrible choice, and it's all that you want to just tell them, like, don't go out with that guy. That is bad news. It is not going to work. And in fact, it may end really poorly for you. Or don't hang out with those people. I know they seem like fun, but it's not the right path to go down. You've been down it. You've seen other people go down those pathways. You just want to tell that young person what to do. But you need to listen first. They won't hear you. The listening has to be established. The crazy thing is, though, that young people are so not used to being listened to that they won't even necessarily know that they're being listened to. They'll assume that they're being dismissed until you make it really clear that you're listening to them. Over the years, just one, anecdotal tip in terms of how to put this into practice, to ask a question to demonstrate that you've been listening, that I found to work really well, is just to say, "Hey, can you tell me more about that?" And they'll be stunned often at first. My students who sit in my office will sort of like, and I've actually had them look around as though I'm talking to somebody behind them, because they're not used to an adult asking them a follow-up question. They're used to adults just talking to them. And if you simply ask, "Can you tell me more about that?" It doesn't require any knowledge. Like, they could be talking about the newest challenge on TikTok and you don't know what it is. I promise you, I don't know what it is, but that question will get them to talk about it more. So you can begin to establish, some sort of norms there that you are listening and that they should expect to be listened to when they're around you. Alex told us, "The reason that I stayed at my church is because of my mentor." Now, that's not the important part. I mean, it's not important, but the really important part is what comes next. "She's very hospitable, very loving, very forgiving, non-judgmental, and has been so gracious." There's nothing in there about being an expert. There's nothing in there about staying at the church because of their, vast knowledge of the New Testament or something like this, or the sacraments even though those things are important. The thing that resonates with Alex is this sort of posture of listening: hospitable, loving, forgiving, non-judgmental, etc. That's what got Alex to stick around. It's that leaning into that belongingness. Transparency then is another key aspect for young people. And transparency comes when we share things from our own lives with the young person as a way to say, "I've been through something like that too. especially if you are able and articulate enough to convey that it's not exactly what you're going through, but I can sort of understand because I've had a similar kind of experience. Um, that garners a lot of trust with young people, and it works. Not it's not like there's not some black box that this goes to. They want to know you so that they can trust you. But we know how this works. Society, from a sociological perspective, they're called social scientists call this norms of reciprocity. You know this too. You've experienced it when you walk through. You walk through those double set of doors. There's like a door, and then another 10 feet later, there's another door. When you walk into a building, sometimes you hold the door for somebody who's maybe like 5 feet behind you, and then they get to that second set of double doors, and what do? They hold the door for you. If you had just walked through it, they would have done the same thing, obviously, for even probably for people who are behind them. But you've created this norm of reciprocity by holding that first door open for them. And in fact, I mean, in that sense, like it's completely illogical, right? Like you get to the door first, you hold it open, they go through it, but now they're first in line, so now they hold the door open for you, so you can get through. It doesn't make any sense. But what has happened is that you've sort of created this expectation of how people should behave, and in some ways, that person then has built up a social debt with you that they feel the need to repay. And so when you share something about your life with a young person, you're doing the same thing for them. You're creating an expectation about how you're supposed to interact with each other, and you're opening up a sort of social debt that young person's like, well, shoot, they just told me this thing about their life. I guess I need to say another thing about my life. And before you know it, you've got an actual relationship. That's in large part how relationships occur. You can do it over and over and over again. Norms of reciprocity work all the time with lots of people. The other thing that happens when you do this is that you begin to shift the narrative from you as an out group member to that young person's reference group, and you start to become an in group member because now they know something intimate, or feel like they know something intimate about who you are. Okay, well, what the really unique thing that happens with in-group members is that we are way more forgiving of in-group members. We are way less likely to sort of make stereotypes about them, and we let them more into our lives because we know that they're thinking about us the same way, that they're more forgiving about us. So it can really help to sort of seed the pathway for the kind of vulnerability that you need with a young person in order to ultimately gain the influence and an authority in their lives that you're trying to have with good intention, trying to have. Integrity is the fourth part of this. Third part of this rather. 80% of young people trust someone who admits when they are wrong. It's just not a thing that adults are good at. It's not a thing the church is good at. Adults in the church really terrible at it. But when they can do it, when they can admit that they're wrong about something, it goes a really long way. Fortunately, there's a fairly straightforward way to do it. To have the kind of integrity that builds trust. Follow up with young people in ways that show that you care about their needs, so that you've heard it, and then own up when you don't or aren't able to. So you got to follow through with your commitments and be accountable. Take responsibility for your mistakes. Lastly, then you got to be authentic by admitting what you don't know. So a lot of the mistake that people make when working with young people is that last thing. They think they have to know everything or have an answer for everything, and so sometimes we sort of rush into saying things that we're not even necessarily certain about ourselves. And you can do so much good with young people by just straight up at the beginning admitting that you don't know the answer to that, or you've always been curious about that yourself, combining integrity and transparency. Or you can certainly correct the record and say, I know we've talked about this in the past, but my mind is sort of changing about it. I heard this thing the other day. What do you think? Those things will go a tremendous way towards demonstrating your integrity in the lives of young people. Lastly, then, I'm sorry, I'm one ahead of myself. Fourthly, care. Again, numbers that are overwhelming, that care is a way to build trust with young people. Camille tells us this in this really nice story. She says, I had a few very difficult experiences during my undergraduate years because of my health, which meant my relationships to teachers weren't always really a matter of advancing a career. They were a matter of making sure I was healthy and safe and all of those things. I think that's why radical empathy was so huge for me. I was coming into contact with new identities, and they were navigating space with me as part of their support for me. Now, I'm sure her teachers didn't not care about class, but what Camille remembers, what she understands, is that they demonstrated care for her above and beyond or outside of just the course material. And that's what lives with her. It doesn't mean that um, you know the fundamental laws of nature aren't important for Camille. Maybe they're not. I don't know what she does these days. But in other words, like the content is still important, but you can do both. The thing and the pathway towards getting the content to stick um, is through the venue, through the lens of care. And I think if we're really honest with ourselves, that's been not only the case with the young people that we work with, but it's probably was the case for us as we were growing up as well. It is probably no small accident that I ended up becoming an English major as an undergraduate because I had really amazing English teachers, literature teachers, going all the way back through middle school. It's probably, and I don't mean like they knew Shakespeare. I mean, they were amazing because they knew me, which in the life of a 14, 15, 16-year-old, that's what qualifies somebody as amazing, that they take the time to know you. But none of this matters. You can do all of those things, all four of those things. Expertise still is a necessary part of the equation. Young people do not want you to be their friend. They have enough friends. I mean, maybe not, but you are not the one to be their friend. They told us over and over again because we kept thinking that this is what we were going to hear. So we kept asking them and they kept correcting us that they don't want adults to be their friends. They want adults to be guides, mentors, coaches, and teachers, not buddies. Their friends are often the source of the stress and anxiety and loneliness and isolation that they feel. Because friends, don't always, as we explored way back at the beginning of this presentation, sometimes good friends don't act like good friends. They want you to be something steadier than that, and that requires expertise. 84% of young people say that they trust someone who not only knows a lot, but uses that knowledge then to help them. So it's not just this sort of like ego filling, like, look at all this stuff I know, right? But that it gets enacted in a way that combines with transparency, integrity, listening, and care to resonate with a young person to be able to make productive changes in their lives. You remember way back at the beginning, we looked at trust among young people, barely cracking the halfway point on a 10-point scale. Well, when we look at the data around trust in relationships, and particularly those 5 dimensions of relational authority, we see a much different story emerging. We see numbers that are sort of off the charts. I mean, they're numbers beyond what anybody would have predicted. They're upwards, in the high 80s, low 90s. Catholics here fared no differently. Young Catholics fared no differently on these scores than other young people across the board. And so these relationships, if what we really want to do is make a difference in the lives of young people, well, we need to have some influence over them. So some reason that they'll listen to us, this thing that we call, you need to have relational authority, because your organizational, your institutional authority is not going to carry the day anymore. It simply is a new world that we're living in. As part of developing the State of Religion Young People Catholic Edition, we've been doing a series of focus groups with youth leaders from across the country. And we pulled out the Catholic youth leader data and we started looking at it. I just want to show you some of the ways that that the relational authority framework is talked about in our focus groups and getting used by people. So Frank is a college chaplain. He says, our students are unbelievably creative and curious and incredibly skeptical of institutions, like simultaneously. And he said, so institutional authority is out and relational authority is in. Frank goes on to say, when you're working in a chaplaincy situation, you're often confused for being institutional as opposed to being relational because you're seen as a part of the structure. So I'm finding ways to break that down and cultivate those really potent relationships that can happen when you actually trust the person in front of you. One of the biggest ways I found of doing that is not by trying to fix my students. Again, just being the expert, right? In the way that everyone else around them seems to be trying to fix them. Not only that, also not trying to tell them what their problem is, instead of listening to hear what they think their problem is. Again, I don't mean to suggest that this is easy, because when you can see the problem so clearly and you know it's a problem, it can be hard to sit and listen to what the person thinks is the problem, especially if they don't see it the same way you do. And I know it can feel like nothing to sit and listen, but you're not doing nothing. You're laying the groundwork and the foundation to be the relational authority in that young person's life when there's a time of crisis. And if you try and jump the gun and just do that stuff first, you won't be able to make as much headway, even though the temptation is so great. Victoria tells us, it was really interesting just to hear when we asked them, what do you need? We had a conversation around that. And we talked about what we could do as a council to help young people. And a lot of what we heard was that they're just tired. They need support. They need love. They need God. And at this point, I'm thinking, oh, wow, this is great. And then someone wrote down, we need deodorant. And I'm like, yes, you do. You need that too. This comes during the pandemic. Young people are just tired. How do you minister to young people at this point? Well, I'm not sure that you could do much better than to understand how tired they are. What is the source of their fatigue? What challenges are they facing, and just giving them an outlet to talk about them. Maybe right now isn't the time to do big theological lifting. Maybe that could wait, I don't know, 6 months or something until we have vaccines widely available. Lastly, then, Peter tells us the programmatic approach simply doesn't work. You're going to have to be in relationship with people. That means you have to build up a whole new volunteer base who actually like people, as opposed to a membership-based society, which is what our church was 50, 60 years ago. But we still operate under that same structure, expecting a new result. Peter's got this, I think, dead on. It's that old model, that old institutionally driven model. It wasn't bad. There is nothing inherently wrong with it. It simply doesn't work right now. And when something stops working, we should pivot to the things that do work without compromising who we are. And so if programs don't work, fine. Let's give up the programs. Let's start doing relationships. If that's clearly what young people are asking for and telling us is effective. At Springtide, we've got a project that sort of brings all this together, much of this together in the spring. It's called Work Life, helping young people flourish and find balance. The basic premise here is that unless you're going to become a priest or a minister in some way, religious leaders have largely abdicated any role in helping young people to decide what they want to do in life, what they're going to be in terms of their work lives. And this comes at a time when work has never been more stressful, harder to find, or more precarious. How do you find a job that is meaningful? Or if you don't have the privilege of pursuing work that is meaningful, how do you find meaning at the work that you have to do? These are lessons that religious leaders have readily available, but they just so often aren't a part of those conversations. We have preliminary data here, so I'm not putting it on the screen because just in case as we clean and analyze it, some of these numbers might move a little bit. But when we ask young people to tell us how they feel about work in the future, the most common answers, with over 60% responding, were fear, anxiety, and uncertainty, but also enthusiasm and excitement. We don't use the language of calling very often for non-religious kinds of jobs and careers, but that is increasingly how young people, without using that term, they're sort of describing calling when we do these interviews with them, but they don't have these religious guides and mentors to help them frame it in that way. So consequently, we've got a whole lot of people who really want to do meaningful work, but don't know how to talk about it. Nearly 70% of young people feel high levels of stress about their future and fear making the wrong decision. But fewer than half of young people overall have good mentors for career decisions. And the trend tends to look worse as young people get older and closer to the workforce. So 13 to 17-year-olds tend to have a lot of models and people to talk to in age-appropriate ways. We're not asking a 15-year-old what, if they've considered the IRA plan at the company they'd like to work for. But 18 to 25-year-olds have comparatively fewer, even though they're right on the doorstep, and in many ways are a year or two or three into an actual career. And faith leaders are far down the list when young people tell us who they are comfortable turning to when talking about a career. They're like close to the bottom. Only 16% say that their faith matters a great deal as they make future plans, even as they describe things that sound a lot like religiously informed kinds of career choices, wanting meaningful things that are impactful to the world, that are of service to others. They don't equate that with faith because they don't have people helping them to translate those things in quite that same language. In fact, a third of 13 to 17-year-olds say that living out their faith at work is not important at all. But 93% of them say that down the line, when they get a job, it is at least somewhat important that their work should be an expression of who they are. And 31% of all young people say that faith is at least a consideration as they plan for their future job. So again, we have all these conflicting things. Faith is a part of who I am. I think that, my faith is at least somewhat important to the job that I would like to do, but I don't need to live it out at work because I don't have the language and framework. So what we're going to be doing in work life is to help propose a framework out of the social sciences that maps onto the data that you can then begin to take up as you work with young people. If you're looking for like, where should we be doing relational authority? Well, I think, really this should start in terms of thinking about how young people are considering and making sense of where they're going to spend the biggest chunk of time in their life. And that is going to be, for a variety of reasons, almost certainly at work. And we need to make sure that they're equipped to do so in a way that is fulfilling and meaningful and in balance with all the other aspects and dimensions of who they are. So you can look for that. That is coming out. That'll be out this spring, late May of 2021. Right now, you can get the State of Religion and Young People. You can see us. Please follow us on social media. We put out stuff. We put out guides and all kinds of things, shorter research findings at We Are Springtide. You can follow me if you, for some reason, want to know more about the mountains that I hike or what my 10-year-old is doing in the backyard at Dr. Josh Packard on Twitter, and follow along with the study there at that hashtag. And know that, again, in January of 2021, we'll have the State of Religion and Young People Catholic edition coming out. You can sign up for that by signing up for the newsletter on our website, or you can find it on our website when January rolls around. Okay, that's all I've got for you, everybody. Thanks a lot. I look forward to the Q&A section of this. I appreciate you taking the time with me today.